Baghdad wakes to a sound it can't negotiate with. Hooves, thousands of them, beating winter ground beyond the canals. The city of paper, law, and learning looks out and realizes it's being measured like a target. And the terrifying part is how fast the measuring becomes a plan. In February 1258, Hulagu Khan arrives with an army built for motion and obedience, an imperial machine sent west under Great Khan Munka's directive, as historians like Peter Jackson emphasize. Baghdad is still the Abbasid capital, still symbolic, yet politically isolated. The question is, isolated by accident or by miscalculation? Before the siege clock starts, we need to see what Baghdad actually is. Not a single House of Wisdom fantasy, but a dense ecosystem. Scribes, jurists, teachers, book markets, accountants, river engineers. Civilization here is administration made physical. And that's exactly what the Mongols are about to test first. Hugh Kennedy notes that by the 1200s, the caliph's direct military power had shrunk, even if the title still carried enormous legitimacy. In the palace, Caliph al-Mustasim receives reports that feel like thunder getting closer. He is a symbol expected to act like an army, and symbols don't hold walls by themselves. Now, meet the other kind of power. Hulagu in a felt kaftan, not in a throne room, but in open air, with maps and messengers. David Morgan describes Mongol warfare as speed plus intelligence plus incorporated expertise. They don't just ride, they calculate. And their calculation starts with one word: encircle. Baghdad is a city built on water control. Canals, embankments, river traffic on the Tigris like blood in veins. That order is also a vulnerability. If you can seize crossings and gates, you don't need to storm every street. You can make the city fight its own geography, and the Mongols know it. Inside the chancery, our Baghdad scribe copies orders fast enough to blur the ink, bundling papers with twine, tax tallies, supply lists, diplomatic drafts. This is the paper empire at work, reality turned into documents. But what happens when the documents can't summon help, only record the lack of it? The Mongols arrive with more than cavalry. Siege engineers, some drawn from conquered peoples, measure range, timber, stone shot. Jackson and Morgan both stress this. Mongol conquest isn't only terror, it's organization. And as the first earthworks rise, Baghdad's walls stop being symbols and become math problems. Chroniclers disagree on the precise day count, but the remembered shock is the same. The city goes from normal to trapped in about 2 weeks. Roads close first. Then river approaches. Then any hope that this is just a raid. Baghdad looks outward for allies and finds only calculations of self-preservation. Here's the psychological weapon. Mongol diplomacy often comes as an ultimatum backed by a reputation. Submit and live under new rules. Resist and risk annihilation. Baghdad's court debates what submission even means for a caliph. But every hour spent debating is an hour the siege lines tighten, and they are tightening right now. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi appears in this story not as a superhero, but as a symbol of expertise moving through power. He writes while the city trembles, numbers, notes, lists, because states run on information. Yet information can't stop stones, and the first stones are about to fly. When the bombardment begins, it's not cinematic chaos, it's rhythm, thump, whistle, impact. The engineer watches angles, not emotions. Hulagu watches results, not speeches. And Baghdad's defenders realize something chilling. The attackers are not improvising, they're executing a timetable. Baghdad tries to answer with sorties, brief rushes beyond the walls, an attempt to disrupt construction. But against a force built to absorb shocks and keep building, disruption becomes a gesture. The scribe records losses and ration counts, watching language turn from confident to conditional. And then the river becomes the next battlefield. Water under siege means this: canals and embankments can be protected or turned. Medieval accounts describe flooding and breaches. Modern historians treat details cautiously, but the logic is clear. Control the waterworks, and you control movement, food, and morale. Baghdad's ordered geometry starts to warp into mud. In the palace, Al-Mustasim receives news that should have come earlier. Relief forces are not coming in strength. Fragmented loyalties, regional self-interest, fear of Mongol retaliation, Baghdad's symbolic center can't command the periphery anymore. Kennedy's point becomes painfully visible, and the caliph's face changes before he speaks. This is the countdown's hinge. Diplomacy narrows, then snaps. Messages go out, replies return colder. The Mongols don't need to hate Baghdad to destroy it, they only need to classify it as defiant. And once that classification locks in, the siege stops being pressure and becomes procedure. Quick pause. If you're into history told like a war desk logbook with sources and the human texture left intact, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you think Baghdad's fate was sealed by Mongol superiority or by the politics that left it alone? Because the next phase is where sealed becomes literal. Now the siege accelerates. The engineers' crews work in shifts, hands raw from rope and timber. The Mongol camp runs like a city of its own. Messengers, supplies, discipline. Baghdad, meanwhile, is a city trying to remain a city while being turned into a perimeter. And perimeters don't feed children. The scribe walks corridors carrying bundles of paper like sandbags, orders, permissions, ration notes, trying to keep the state coherent. But coherence requires trust, and trust requires time. Outside, stones keep landing on the same sections of wall again and again until wall becomes cracked wall. And cracked walls invite a single terrible question. Chroniclers later reach for metaphors, rivers darkened, libraries erased, because plain description feels too small. But even without the poetry, the mechanism is brutal. Once a city is isolated, every shortage multiplies. Food becomes leverage, water becomes leverage, fear becomes leverage, and Hulagu is about to apply all three at once. Baghdad's defenders attempt negotiation again, not from strength, but from arithmetic. How many days of grain? How many intact towers? How many soldiers who can still stand? The caliph's court sends words meant to slow time. But Mongol time is different. It's measured in completed tasks. And the next task is a breach. When the breach finally opens, it doesn't look like an instant collapse. It looks like a new doorway where no doorway should exist. Defenders rush, plug, reinforce, then another impact widens it. The engineer nods, almost bored, because the math checks out. And Baghdad realizes the walls were never the final defense. The final defense was always the idea that the Caliphate could not be touched, that legitimacy itself was armor. But legitimacy doesn't stop a siege ladder. Al-Mustasim sits with sealed letters and realizes the seals mean less than the sound outside. And in that quiet, the city's symbolic center becomes a trapped room. Here's a pattern interrupt that modern historians push us toward. Stop imagining the Mongols as chaotic destroyers. This is a state enforcing compliance with methods honed across continents. That doesn't lessen the horror. It clarifies it. Because what's coming is not an accident. It's a decision executed cleanly. Baghdad's streets begin to show the siege's true shape. Not just impacts, but absence. Shops shuttered, courtyards empty. The scribe passes a bookseller's stall where ledgers lie open, abandoned mid-line. Civilization doesn't vanish in one blow. It leaks out through 1,000 interrupted routines. And the next interruption is the surrender move. Under pressure, the caliph's court chooses the option that feels like it might save the city: surrender, or something close to it. But surrender in Mongol logic is not a conversation. It's a status change. Hulagu has to believe it's complete, immediate, and useful. And Baghdad is about to learn what happens when surrender arrives too late. Accounts vary on the exact sequence, but the remembered momentum is relentless. Once the city is taken, control becomes the priority, then punishment, then extraction. Arabic chroniclers like Ibn Kathir and Al-Dahab write with grief and moral weight. Juvain, writing within Mongol authority, frames it differently. And those differences tell us something unsettling. The sack becomes a civilizational shock in memory because Baghdad was not just buildings, it was systems. Records, courts, schools, water management, trade trust. When those systems break, people don't just lose homes, they lose the map of how life works. And as the city's order fractures, the soundscape changes from busy to hollow. Medieval casualty numbers explode into the hundreds of thousands or more, depending on the chronicler. Modern historians like Morgan and Jackson warn us to treat those figures cautiously. Rhetoric and trauma inflate numbers. But skepticism about exact counts is not skepticism about catastrophe. The catastrophe is real enough to silence a metropolis. The scribe, our witness to bureaucracy, now faces a choice that feels like an accusation: carry records or carry water to someone bleeding. He looks at the satchel, then at the street. Paper was his job. People are his city. And when he drops the bundle, you can almost hear an era hitting the ground. Hulagu's command post remains disciplined, because conquest requires administration immediately after violence. This is the paradox. Destruction and governance are adjacent in imperial logic. The engineer who built the breach now supervises repairs and control points, and the city that once managed water now has its water managed by strangers. Al-Mustasim is escorted under guard, no longer the untouchable center but a valuable captive symbol. The camera should not gloat here. It should feel cold and procedural, like a stamp on a document. Because in this moment, the Abbasid Caliphate's Baghdad chapter is closing, and the question becomes, what survives when the chapter ends? The famous images, libraries destroyed, ink in the river, live in memory because they translate systemic loss into a single picture. Attribute them as memory, not measurement. What we can say with confidence: Baghdad's scholarly and administrative networks are shattered locally, but networks by nature reroute, and that rerouting begins almost immediately. This is where the story refuses to be a simple end of civilization tale. Islamic civilization doesn't stop in 1258. What ends is Abbasid rule in Baghdad. Later Abbasid caliphs exist in Cairo under Mamluk patronage. Continuity of title, not restoration of the old state. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Juvena's perspective, embedded in the new order, shows how Mongol rule in the region quickly depends on Persianate administration. The conquerors need clerks, tax registers, supply chains. The paper empire doesn't vanish, it gets repurposed. And that's uncomfortable. The same skills that built Baghdad's order can serve the system that broke it. The Ilkhanate that follows becomes a major Middle Eastern polity, and over time its rulers engage deeply with the region's culture, administration, and eventually Islam. That arc doesn't redeem the sack, it explains the aftermath. Empires don't just burn, they also absorb. And the absorption begins in the ashes while survivors are still counting the missing. Let's return to the siege itself and name the turning point clearly. The moment diplomacy becomes irrecoverable, and the Mongol command commits to full assault after isolating the city's approaches and river infrastructure. That's the spine modern historians emphasize: constraints, decisions, logistics. And once that decision is made, about 2 weeks becomes a sentence, not a statistic. Notice what isn't in this story: a single heroic duel, a last-minute cavalry rescue, a secret weapon. What's here is administrative weakness meeting operational strength. Baghdad's court can write letters, Hulagu can move armies. And when those two realities collide, the faster system wins, unless the slower system changes before it's forced to. Baghdad's vulnerability isn't just political, it's infrastructural. A low-lying city dependent on embankments and canals can be made to drown, to starve, to freeze in place. Chroniclers emphasize waterworks damage. We should treat specifics carefully, but the strategic principle is undeniable. And the principle is what makes this siege feel inevitable. The engineer's world is pegs, rope, angles, and repetition. He doesn't need to hate the city to break it. He only needs time and resources. That's why the siege feels like a factory. And when the factory's product is a breach, the city's defenders are forced into a choice between dying on the wall or dying in the streets. If you're wondering whether Baghdad was doomed, the honest answer is complicated. Mongol capability is real, but so is Baghdad's isolation. Its inability to mobilize a credible coalition, its court politics, its strategic misread. The tragedy is that each factor amplifies the others, and the amplification reaches its peak the moment the gates open. After capture, the city's silence is what stays with you. Not the noise of battle, but the absence of the normal noises. Bargaining, lessons, recitations, scribes calling for more paper. The camera should linger on empty desks and broken shelves because that's what a systemic collapse looks like. And then we ask the hardest question: what did the world lose here? It lost a hub, an administrative and cultural switching station. Baghdad's bureaucracy connected regions, its markets connected continents, its scholars connected generations. When that hub is destroyed, the network doesn't die, but it stutters. People and books move elsewhere, patronage shifts, and the memory of Baghdad becomes a warning encoded in stories. That's why later writers treat the sack as an end of an era. Not because learning ended, but because a particular center stopped functioning as the symbolic axis of a Sunni polity. In memory literature, it becomes a moral lesson about unity, governance, and complacency. But history is more forensic than moral, and the forensic view reveals something colder. It was preventable only with power Baghdad no longer had. Let's zoom out. Hulagu's campaign is part of a strategic program to neutralize regional powers and secure routes and tribute. Again, Jackson's framing. Baghdad is not singled out by fate, it's singled out by strategy. Once the Mongol Empire decides the region must be reorganized, symbolic capitals become targets, and symbols fall fast when they stand alone. Back on the ground, the scribe searches for surviving colleagues, but finds only fragments: a pen case in dust, a half-burned document, a seal stamp without its owner. This is how history becomes personal, through objects that outlive the people who use them. And it's also how propaganda begins. Every survivor will tell the story differently, and each version will fight for meaning. So when you hear a clean 13 days claim, remember, day counts vary by chronicle, and about 2 weeks is safer unless we're quoting a named source. But the point of the number isn't precision, it's velocity. A city that took centuries to build can be broken in days when the attacker controls time, and time in siege warfare is a weapon. The Mongols' use of terror as policy, instrumental, not random, means the sack sends a message beyond Baghdad. Submit, and you might be incorporated. Resist, and you might be erased. That's why nearby rulers calculate so carefully, and why Baghdad's isolation deepens even as its need grows. And once fear becomes a diplomatic language, words lose their power. If we strip the drama down to mechanics, the siege is a checklist. Isolate, bombard, breach, control water, break morale, take the center, reorganize. Each step is solvable, and the Mongols solve them in sequence. Baghdad's defenders solve some too, but they're solving under scarcity, and scarcity makes every solution temporary. Al-Tusi, the scholar administrator, stands amid this and embodies the uncomfortable continuity. Expertise survives regimes. In one scene, he writes calmly while the city shakes, because the mind keeps working even when the world breaks. Later, he will be part of the knowledge that continues elsewhere. But right now, knowledge is not safe. It's just alive. The Caliph's tragedy is that he's trapped between two kinds of legitimacy: religious, symbolic authority, and the raw legitimacy of force. He can command prayers, Hulagu can command engineers. In a stable world, symbols and force cooperate. In 1258 Baghdad, they collide, and the collision produces a silence that no sermon can fill. We also have to resist a lazy frame: civilization versus barbarism. The Mongol state is not anti-civilization. It's a different civilization with different tools and incentives. That doesn't excuse destruction. It explains capability. And once you understand capability, the fall of Baghdad stops looking like a freak disaster and starts looking like a forecast that was ignored. So what is the real annihilation here? Not the end of Islam, not the end of scholarship everywhere, but the annihilation of a particular urban machine: Baghdad's ability to coordinate, archive, adjudicate, and attract. When that machine breaks, the region's balance shifts, and that shift sets up the next century's politics, including the rising prominence of the Mamluks and new centers of patronage. In the ruins, the scribe finds one intact seal impression, perfect, crisp, a tiny, absurd proof that the old order could still make beauty and pressure. He pockets it, not as treasure, but as evidence. Because someday someone will ask how a world could collapse so fast, and he'll have a piece of the answer in his hand. The Mongol engineer, meanwhile, walks the riverbank and checks the embankment like a doctor checking a pulse. Control points are established, movement is regulated. The city's bloodstream is now under foreign hands. That's the final transformation. Baghdad goes from being a center that controls flows to a place controlled by flows. And that inversion is the conquest's true signature. When later generations remember 2 weeks, they're not only remembering violence, they're remembering helplessness, the sensation that a city of learning and administration could be reduced to survival math. Chroniclers write to make sense of it. Historians like Kennedy, Jackson, and Morgan try to explain it. Survivors just carry it. And the carry is what keeps the story alive. The legacy is not only loss, it's reconfiguration. The Ilkhanate builds a new political order, scholars migrate, libraries are rebuilt elsewhere, administrative techniques persist. The wound remains, but life reorganizes around it. That's the sober truth. History doesn't stop for grief. And the final question is what we do with the warning encoded in Baghdad's fall. Because Baghdad's story is also a story about modern assumptions. We like to believe advanced systems protect themselves automatically. But systems are only as strong as the coalitions that defend them and the decisions that anticipate threats. Baghdad had brilliance, yet it lacked leverage at the decisive moment. And that gap between brilliance and leverage is where empires die. So if you take one image from this episode, let it be this: a city built on controlled water and controlled words, facing an empire built on controlled movement and controlled fear. Neither is simple. Both are organized. And when they collide, the speed of organization matters as much as the morality of it, which is why the siege feels like a countdown you can't pause.